Bong Joon Ho's Parasite powerfully evokes the experience of living as a lower class family that is struggling to maintain its humanity and spirit despite its precarious existence. It masterfully depicts the paralyzing effects of inequality, not only on families that are overwhelmed by forces larger than themselves, but on social relationships as a whole. I think it's a really compelling film because it reveals the lived experience of poverty and prejudice against the poor, showing us that class hierarchies are not just the product of wealth disparities, but are equally generated through a web of customs and expectations that makes the line between rich and poor binding. Then in this video essay, I'll take a look at how Bong Joon Ho expertly blends elements of the real and surreal to reinforce his message that capitalism, at its worst, disempowers the individual and reduces their ability to have an authentic or rewarding go at life. Finally, I'm going to talk about why hope and fantasy play such a big role in the film, and why it is that Bong Joon Ho chooses to leave us with a sense of hopelessness and profound tragedy by its end. But before I get into the stylistic elements of the film I want to focus on, what sort of world is established for us in Parasite right from the beginning? Well, for the Kim family, it's a world that is dirty, cramped, and squalid. A world where everything is uncertain, whether it be food, internet connection, or employment. In other words, it's a sort of liminal existence, where without constant struggle, you will sink and fall below. Despite this, the Kim family seems to maintain a tired, even hopeful resilience, as they continue to hunt for jobs and perform menial labour for dismal wages. The basement they live in serves as a key representation of this way of existence. In discussing it in an interview, Bong Joon Ho alludes to the constant fear of falling below for those on the poverty line. Semi-basement means you're half above the ground, half beneath it. They still want to believe that they're overground, but carry this fear that they could fall completely below. It's that limbo state that reflects their economic status. Further, in the context of South Korea, most social relations are shown to be transactional and competitive because they are determined by the influence of capital. Money is at all times in the film the silent motivator, and almost all of the Kim's daily experiences are rooted in transactions of some kind. Their ability to access the internet is contingent on a weak Wi-Fi signal offered by a business that is looking to draw in customers. Similarly, Ki-woo's catch up with an old friend quickly turns to a conversation about money and the possibility for social advancement. What's more, all the advice he is given here implicitly suggests that in order to ascend South Korea's social hierarchy, one must employ shady tactics and deception, because standard notions of morality hold little sway in a social sphere driven by competition alone. Parasite further shows us how rigid class hierarchies are not just the product of wealth disparities, but are actively reinforced through certain social customs, behaviours, and expectations that we often don't consider. And these norms generate a subtle, yet very real line of division between the rich and poor that is near impossible to cross. Now, you might point out that the Parks are incredibly good at manipulating the social customs of the rich to their advantage. This, of course, is where much of the film's initial comedy is generated, as the Kims slowly infiltrate the Park household. Ki-young is an expert at manipulating Mrs. Park's belief that her son is a gifted genius who simply needs the right tutor to let his talents flourish. Ki-woo is similarly adept at changing his style of speech to give himself an air of professionalism. But ultimately, the Parks still have all the hard power, as there's nothing they could really lose, except maybe their pride if they were to catch on to this deception. The subtle power dynamics which play out between the two families are particularly important in showing us the upper class characters have a near godlike omnipotence in deciding what is just and right. This keeps those below them on edge through continual discipline and punishment. This particularly occurs in perhaps the most cruel way when the Parks fire Moon Gwang, their loyal and scrupulous maid, despite her many years of sacrifice to the family, showing she is ultimately expendable to them, more of an object to be used than a human being. Moon Gwang, without a stable income, is then left to fend for her own, at the mercy of predatory loan sharks. This same dynamic is further revealed in the exchanges between Mr. Kim and Mr. Park. On the one hand, they exchange friendly conversation, and Mr. Park even openly invites advice on his personal life. On the other, he reasserts his power continually through insisting that a good driver must never cross the line, and by disciplining Mr. Kim for his mistakes and oversights. The idea of crossing the line here becomes a powerful metaphor, in the sense that Mr. Park has a total monopoly in interpreting where exactly that moral line is. That is to say, he possesses greater social capital because he sets the rules of the game, whilst Mr. Kim is left scrambling to figure out on his own what exactly those rules are and how he can perform adequately. As the film progresses, this motif of crossing the line becomes more and more developed, because this line not only delineates people's social behaviour, but can even determine their very worth as a human being. This is made abundantly clear in the scene where Mr. Kim overhears Mr. Park talking about his scent, stating callously that his smell crosses the line. Here, Bong Joon Ho impresses the extent to which class identity cannot be fully transcended or overcome, because of the existence of this near-invisible yet ever-present line between the two families. There will always be some aspect of Mr. Kim's lower class status which will cling to him and define him, even as he conforms to every performative standard of the upper class he can, whether it be dress, behaviour, or politeness. Now, of course, Parasite is a film with no villains and no real heroes either. What is so powerful about the film is it doesn't push an overbearing narrative where the rich are maniacal monsters and the poor are saints. The Kims, of course, rely heavily on deception and lying in order to get ahead, to the extent that it clouds their own capacity for empathy and leads them to violence. But when Mr. Kim finally snaps at the film's end, he's acting out a lived experience of horror. Horror at the fact that despite his relentless attempts to climb the ladder throughout his life, there is some part of him perceived as inherently inferior by the upper class. Thus, we can interpret the film's climax in two ways. Either Mr. Kim is tragically fulfilling the very caricature long imposed on him, or he is asserting the only freedom he has left in a world that has otherwise stolen that freedom away from him. A criticism commonly levelled at the film is just how absurd certain sequences are, and how this absurdity undermines the power of his message. Many people point to the overt violence at the film's end as unsatisfying or too unrealistic. However, this is a strongly intentional decision from Bong Joon Ho, and a key aspect of his style as an auteur. By blending the surreal with elements of the real, he is presenting a visual argument for how capitalism, at its worst, entangles us in relationships and experiences that are arbitrary, almost dreamlike, detaching us from authentic engagement with the world. For me at least, the grotesquely comical elements that crop up don't in any way trivialise the suffering that plays out. If anything, they serve to imprint on us an enduring sense of horror. Bong Joon Ho's point is that certain parts of reality under capitalism, particularly for those who reside in its underbelly, are indeed surreal and irrational. Take, for example, the power struggle between the Kims and Moon Gwang and her husband, which ensues when the family's phone has been taken away from them, and Moon Gwang now has incriminating evidence against them. It's worth noting just how unreal and perversely comical Bong Joon Ho makes this scene. For example, the phone's symbolic role here is basically a weapon, a means of asserting Moon Gwang's total domination over the Kims through coercing them into submission. But if you think about it, it's bizarre how many human lives hang in the balance in this moment, purely due to a short video on a smartphone. What's more, Moon Gwang relishes her newfound power over the Kims, and shares jokes about North Korea with her husband, jokes which don't seem to match the gravity of the situation at all. The matching tragedy in the scene is the fact that each party can only see the other in symbolic, abstracted terms when money and survival is their central motivator. And because of their inability to engage with their common plight in that moment or their common class identity, the precariousness of their position forces them into a violent battle royale with only one winner. As the two parties mercilessly face off against each other in the film, culminating in a moment of horrific violence against Moon Gwang, This scene perhaps embodies best the sense of a mutually destroyed working class, their lack of defense to tragedy, their futile proximity to potential help or agency, as an anonymous author for Entropy writes. This shows us that whenever horror devices are used in the film, they always reinforce a crushing sense of tragic realism. This is a key aspect of all of Bong Joon Ho's previous works and his artistic style generally, with films like Snowpiercer and The Host being notorious for their combination of meaningful social messages, black comedy, and horror. Another key aspect of Parasite's unique style I want to discuss is Bong Joon Ho's tendency to introduce elements of fantasy and hopefulness, but in each case he makes a deliberate point to extinguish every moment of fantasy, every moment wherein the Kims envision a better world for themselves, as soon as that moment arises. For example, just as the family begins to celebrate their timely victory over the Parks by indulging in a moment of luxury, they receive a surprise phone call from them. This phone call signifies the crushing weight of reality, the sad truth that their momentary share in the Park's riches will be short-lived and illusory, for they have not in any way surmounted their class limitations. The way in which they are forced to scatter here also tragically recalls Mr. Park's comparison of poor people to cockroaches. The scene reaches its climax as the family return to their house with mounting dread, only to find it completely flooded and their possessions all but destroyed. This is perhaps the most stark and tragic reminder of the family's lack of social mobility, and it sets up a telling contrast when it comes to the symbolism of water. For the Kims, rain is considered a blessing in disguise, as they are shielded from the natural elements and it keeps their garden green. But for the Parks, this rain represents something deadly and destructive within an already hazardous existence. Indeed, while the poor in Korea may be swept away and destabilized by raging currents, both literal and metaphorical, the rich are like heavy rocks that remain stable and impervious to the elements. Cinematographer Hong Kyung-pyo explains that while the Park residence is built on a highland, unable to be flooded, for the Kims, the semi-basement house that they reach in the end was set to look like the rain was threatening their entire lives, and we shot the scenes accordingly. In this scene, the rain became another antagonist on its own. Within a space of just 5 minutes then, Bong Joon Ho subverts the Kim family's short-lived relief that their plan had worked, and that they had finally achieved a degree of economic stability. Their sense of hope crumbles and fades into nihilism just as quickly, with Mr. Kim concluding that the best plan is no plan. As Alex E. Jung observes, hope is the emotional parasite in the film, the thing that keeps us going, but sucks us dry. There's no better symbol to represent this than the Scholar's Rock. Ki-woo receives the rock from his accomplished friend, making it representative of the possibility of social mobility and prosperity. Whilst his mum states curtly she would have preferred money, Ki-woo ponders that it's very metaphorical, in a sort of playful nod from Bong Joon Ho to his audience that comes to define his subtle humour. Moreover, when the family's house is flooded, the rock actually appears to float in the sewage water, suggesting at the very least that in that moment, in Ki-woo's mind, it is envisioned as hollow, not that the rock itself is hollow in reality. The rock is initially symbolic of hope and possibility, but it instead comes to literally symbolize the dead weight that is dragging Ki-woo down. Because although he is guided by a noble desire to lead his family towards better things throughout the film, as the actor portraying Ki-woo, Song Kang-ho, recalls, all it ends up doing for Ki-woo is bashing his skull in. In fact, Ki-woo ultimately lays the rock back in the river at the film's end, signifying his own coming of age and realization that he can no longer be guided by his illusions. If there's any emotion the film leaves us with, it's an abiding sense of hopelessness. In contrast to the grand narratives we often find in Western cinema, which are resolved with a fairy tale ending or a rousing call to action, the bleak reality is that nothing has substantially changed. With Mr. Park taking up residence below, another parasitic host inhabits a new rich family's basement. Ki-woo envisions one day buying the house and freeing his father in an imagined sequence that by this stage of the film we have learned to distrust and see as pure idealism. Interestingly, the song that plays during Parasite's credits recalls a future where Ki-woo spent his time trying to save up money to buy the house. The lyrics state bleakly that it would take 564 years for him to actually do so. These lyrics were written by Bong Joon Ho himself, and as he states frankly in an interview, "You know and I know, we all know that this kid isn't going to be able to buy that house." I just felt that frankness was right for the film, even though it's sad. And maybe, in another sense, this is a more fitting call to action, because we cannot help but feel an enduring sense of disquiet and of injustice at the film's end. After all, the problems brought up by Parasite can't be swept under the rug, and they can't be changed without meaningful collective action. But by laying bare the terrible, explosive weight of reality, Parasite gives us a wake-up call that we ignore at our own peril. If you enjoyed this video, please let me know in the comments and consider supporting the channel by liking and subscribing.